Welcome to the Boswell Book Company virtual event series. I'm Daniel Golden, proprietor. It is day 4,423 of us being in business. Tonight's event is the debut novel, Gold Diggers, one of my favorite books of spring, and of course, getting rave reviews across the country. Sanjena Sathian is a graduate of the IRA Writers Workshop, an alumna of the Clarion Writers Workshop, and a former Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow. She's worked as a journalist in San Francisco and in Mumbai. And tonight we are honored to have her in conversation with our favorite YA author of spring, Anurada D Rajurkar, who is the debut author of American Betiya. Just to mention one of the wonderful reviews, Ron Charles in the Washington Post, who really leans into the gold imagery. Sanjena Sathian's Gold Diggers is a work of 24-karat genius. This remarkable debut novel, chosen by Mindy Kaling for an upcoming TV series, melts down striving immigrant tales, Old West mythology, even madcap thrillers to produce an invaluable new alloy of American literature. Couldn't have said it better. Thank you both for coming tonight. It's an honor to have
you. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel, for that amazing introduction. Hi, Sanjena. It is amazing to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm so excited. We were just talking before that we've been on all these like South Asian authors having their debuts, having their big entrances lists together. So I feel like, and having read your work, I feel like I know you, but it's really nice to do this together. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I read this brilliant book of yours twice. It is a revelation. It really was. It feels very groundbreaking, so fiercely funny. And it's a coming of age satire steeped in, it has a lot of magical realism. And I just loved it. So would you want to maybe begin with just telling us a little bit about what the story is about? And then maybe if you want to do a little reading?
Sure, absolutely. So the kind of only context you need for this opening is the narrator, Neil Narayan, is 15 years old. He's growing up in a fictional suburb of Atlanta, Georgia called Hammond Creek. And at the start of this chapter, he went to a high school dance where there was a little bit of drama. He had a fight with his best friend and his crush, Anita. And the novel kind of takes it from there. We follow these characters when they're 15 and 16, and then it picks up again 10 years later in California. But I'll just read a couple of pages, pretty short, just from kind of nearing the middle of this chapter after the fallout of the dance. When I was younger, Anita and Anjali Dayal were held in perfectly fine favor at my house. Our two families mingled pleasantly. As a latchkey kid whose mother was less prolific in the kitchen than Anita's, I often let myself into the Dayal's house to rummage around in the fridge. The key beneath the watering can behind the azalea bush was mine to use. Our parents, the four brown adults in a largely white subdivision, collaborated to create a simulacrum of India in a reliably red Georgia county. But over the past few years, Anita's father, Pranay Shankal, had grown conspicuously absent, discomfiting the other Desi mothers. No one pronounced words like separation. It was stated only that Anita's father was working in California, where he had founded a company with his classmates from the prestigious Indian Institutes of Technology. The official reason for Anita's father living across the country while her mother remained in Hammond Creek was the daughter and a desire not to interrupt her schooling, which is why my mother was overtaken by a frisson of judgment when I came home at the end of May, weeks after spring fling, with the news that Anita would be leaving Okefenokee and, in fact, interrupting her schooling. California, my mother said. I could almost see the Remax Realty signs in her eyes as she dreamt of an open house, overdone chewy sugar cookies and fruit punch, and information on the neighborhood's property values. My mother adored open houses, their mild festivity, the red balloons, the way the houses were held in presentational limbo, vacuumed carpets and potpourri in the powder rooms, until the owner's current unsatisfactory life had been traded out for a better one. To Buckhead, I said. Anita had been accepted into a posh private school in Buckhead, one of the neighborhoods inside the perimeter. The perimeter, referring to Interstate 285, which neatly locked the suburbs away from Atlanta proper, was one of those things to which my mother sometimes mystically referred while in that open house headspace. A state of mind that I swear caused her very large ears to droop and soften, implying that she was listening to something otherworldly, something more splendid than terrestrial gossip. Someday we might live inside the perimeter, she suggested. My father scoffed. In Hammond Creek, we were close to my parents' jobs, good public schools, and other immigrants. Inside the perimeter, he grumbled, were crumbling houses that white people would spend $1 million on because they seemed Margaret Mitchellian. Anita's destination was a school I'd faced at debate tournaments a few times. They never failed to intimidate, showing up with 4 coaches from the best college teams huddled around them. They strutted about in blazers and ties and pearls and heels, while we mopped our sweat with our swamp green Okefenokee High School t-shirts. Her school sat near the long, low lawns of country clubs and the governor's mansion. Its female students would be debutantes, and its alumni seemed, from my position outside its brick-winged gates anyway, to waltz into Harvard and Princeton and Vanderbilt and Georgetown. It made sense. Anita's only plan in life, as long as I had known her, was to attend Harvard. What followed Harvard was a vaguely crimson-tinged blankness. Harvard was sufficient, would propel her into some life thereafter. The first step in achieving that life seemed to be leaving Hammond Creek, Okefenokee High School, and me.
That was amazing. I love the way you read those pages. You know, so Neil is a character. He's the one who is telling the story. He's funny, he's wry, he's observant, he's and like deeply flawed in just ways that were just hilarious and so human. You're not like at all afraid to reveal all his many dimensions and sort of like those flaws, his selfishness, there's an awkwardness, there are times that he's vain, but also really wise. And so I just wondered, like, can you tell us a little bit about his struggle throughout the story and how it like kind of like dovetails with Anita's, but also as the girl across the cul-de-sac that he sort of secretly pines for. They both are struggling in some ways similarly, but they're also both really different. So I was just interested in how you did that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the novel is told from Neil's perspective, but it is sort of about 2 people and about 2 families in many ways. Anita's family, Neil, and Neil's family, and the 2 of them kind of converging. And the 2 of them are really like the 2 halves of me. Anita is what I looked like in high school. She's intense, comically so, high achieving. Her entire personality is driven by this need to achieve and basically to please the adults in her community. Neil, on the other hand, feels like an underachiever. And of course, by most community standards, he would not be an underachiever, but in this world, he feels average. And so we've got this person who looks like they're killing it and this person who is burning out. And together, they both kind of need the same thing, which is ambition as a way to kind of get through the day, not just greed. It kind of becomes greed later. But so it's this like, it's not just a coming of age story. It's these kids who are trying to grow up in a way that makes their parents proud and kind of justifies the immigrant sacrifice that their parents made in coming here. And so that first half, when we're in high school with them, is just about the sort of day-to-day struggles of like what happens when you get a bad grade and your entire sense of self is riding on that bad grade or is on that grade. But when it picks up later, 10 years later, the book becomes interested in how achievement, success, and ambition morph over the course of our lives. What does it look like when you're in your 20s and 30s, and then later your parents are in their 50s? And what is all this for? Like, what was all the striving for? How did it injure you? How did it wound you? And it it affects Neil and Anita each in very different ways. But the book is just interested in kind of turning over what it takes to have ambition and what the costs are.
Exactly. I loved that. And you know, speaking of sort of that ambition, so Neil is finding that he's kind of lacking that ambition that's needed to succeed to the levels that, you know, that community and his parents are expecting of him. Do you feel then, so gold is a really important aspect of the story. Obviously, it's in the title, but it's, you know, it's also an intrinsic part of Indian culture. And it's something I like so appreciated, even in like my opening scene of my book, yellow gold is mentioned because it's just such a huge part of, you know, the Indian culture and way of life. So I guess I was interested, like, so it's gold, it's also its alchemical properties, which was just so inventive and interesting, that take on it. And so I was just feeling like, if so, the alchemical properties takes a center stage as you use this magical realism to this sort of like dazzling effect in the story. Could you talk a little bit more about what Neil and the others do with the gold and like its significance and connection to both American history and the gold rush of 1850, as well as Indian alchemy and like the kind of research and stuff that was involved in incorporating that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, so I started with this contemporary conceit. I had been interested in these gold thefts that happened around the suburbs of Atlanta when I was growing up. And there was like a non-Indian kind of organized crime ring that was held responsible for these. But my mom would always say, like, it's got to involve Indians because these thieves know exactly where to go in the house to find the gold. And that kind of gets to what you're saying. Like there is a sort of, in certain kinds of Indian houses, gold is omnipresent. And it's often treated, it's both like very important and also really casual. Like it's just around. Like when I was doing research for this book, sort of casually, I asked friends and they were like, yeah, like I think my mom kept some in like the Godiva chocolate packets in the pantry just as like another place to store them, but often not in safes, right? And so I just started with that interesting fictional question of like, what would it be like to be a gold thief? And then I backed my way into all these other associations that you're talking about. So I realized I was interested in gold thieves, and I decided that the people who would be fascinating to write about, who could be gold thieves and unlikely gold thieves, would be a mother and a daughter who are sort of pariahs in the community. And so I had Anita's character, I had her mom's character, and then I very kind of late in the process realized that the story was going to be told from Neil's perspective, after writing hundreds of pages from these other characters' perspectives. And so Neil kind of gets involved in these gold thefts, and the jacket will tell you this, so it's not a spoiler. They take this gold that they've stolen from other people, and they smelt it into this magical elixir, consume it, and it allows them to steal other people's ambitions. And after I was like, oh, this is an interesting sort of conceit. I'll follow it. I'll see where it takes me. Then I started doing all this research into everything you flagged, the sort of like alchemical history of gold and the California gold rush history. And these associations just sort of kept springing up out of nowhere. I didn't even have to hunt for them. I learned that in Tantric and Hindu alchemy, people did actually talk about consuming gold, that in fact it was associated not just with stealing ambition from other people, but stealing the ambition kind of the universe itself, like trying to become godlike. And so that's one valence of gold, is it's this unvarnished metal that brings to life our imagination about the possibility of immortality and of power. And then another angle on that is, you know, the California gold rush, and gold in the American imagination is just as important as it is in the Indian imagination. And so getting to weave in, there's a little bit of gold rush history. There's a sort of nested historical tale that Neil becomes consumed with. All of those things just braided in. And I went on like a lot of sort of research discovery moments in writing this.
It's so amazing. I can't even imagine how that like beautiful moment where those pieces of the puzzle fit together, it's just like the best part of being a writer. And they don't happen all the time. So that's amazing. So speaking of the history, the character of Ramesh Uncle was, I loved that character. He reminded me of people that I know and love so much. And he is somebody that Neil meets when he is studying at the library with his debate partner. One summer, he meets a man he is a retired physics professor, and he is kind of doing this exploration of American history. And that's another sort of thread throughout the novel is, he basically learns of this historical figure in all of his, research findings about somebody named the Bombayan. Can you tell us more about this historical significance of the Bombayan and why the discovery of the Bombayan is so riveting and impactful to Neil, who is sort of like still kind of lost and, trying to discover himself, and it actually impacts his own like professional trajectory. So yeah, a little bit more about Ramesh Uncle and the Bombayan.
So the Ramesh Uncle character sort of embodies like a moment of the research discovery process that I was just talking about. I had been interested in the California Gold Rush, just again, because it was like, oh, here's a thematic point that ties in, but also because so many of the books I love have a sense of time and scope in history. I thought a lot about All the King's Men by Robert Penn Warren, A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki, which are novels that are sort of rooted in their place in time, but they're in conversation with a very particular moment in the past. And so I was like, I'm writing about gold. I'm writing this American novel. So I want to try and put it in conversation with the gold rush. And I found this German travelogue uploaded to the Library of Congress archives that told this story that Neil encounters, and I didn't change it very much, put it sort of almost wholesale into the text. And it's the story of basically a quasi-lynch mob. It's a story of a bunch of white Europeans who come across a man who they say is Indian. We honestly don't know if he is. And they accuse him of stealing gold. And something moved me about this story, both the sort of like thrill of recognition of like, we don't have very many records of South Asians being in the US, period. Like before 1917, there are a handful, but this is really early for us to see a presence. Yeah. So Neil experiences that same thrill that I did, which is, I didn't know that we were here. I didn't know that we had a place in American history. And, when he becomes obsessed with this story as I did, I sort of gave him the journey that I had with trying to corroborate the existence of this figure, where I realized basically that this man wasn't going to be able to speak to me out of like the depths of American history because he didn't have a voice. And that's just the story of so many American histories that are not the dominant ones. And for Neil, I think part of the reason this becomes so important is that the possibility of there being other ways of being Indian are a way of freeing himself from who he feels like he has to be in this moment. If he knows more, he could conceive of being someone else, but he doesn't know other ways of being brown.
Exactly. There's this one point in the story, he says, if I had roots in American soil, if we had not all so recently crossed oceans, if our collective past was more textured than I'd been led to believe, then, well, maybe there were other ways of being brown on offer. I just loved that. So speaking about Neil and just thinking about their struggles, both Neil and Anita, they're kind of working against this whole model minority myth, basically. You do an amazing job of showing how the decision for Indian parents to have left all they knew behind and come to this country is sort of like validated or invalidated in many of their minds by how well their kids end up succeeding in a very sort of a narrow way. And so the Bombayan and Ramesh uncle sort of opened that world up for Neil. And so I was kind of interested, like, can you talk a little bit about that decision to show these two sides of the model minority struggle? And, you know, basically with alchemy, you know, without giving spoilers, how does this shared need for that liquid gold and the ambition that it brings sort of a Neil and Anita together, but also like push them apart in a sense?
Yeah. I mean, I know this is something you think about too, but the model minority myth is like part of the way I talk about the book and the way other people are talking about the book, but it's not how I wrote it, right? I didn't write it with that language at like close at hand. It's a nice heuristic, but like it isn't how I felt as a kid. And so I think it's been interesting to hear people read the book and say, okay, you're showing ways of engaging with and pushing back against this experience of being a model minority. But if you are a model minority, you don't walk into a classroom and think, wow, like it is really difficult that like sociologically I have been considered to be X kind of person. Everything is more intimate and pettier. And so for Neil and Anita, it's just their lived experience. For Anita, the particular burden she carries is that her mom was not allowed to achieve everything that she could have achieved as like a middle class Indian woman in growing up in Dadar, in a middle class neighborhood in Bombay. Her brothers got to go to fancy schools and she didn't. And so that particular sort of gaping hole in her mom's experience is directly transplanted onto Anita. But I don't think Anita would ever say that. Like these are things that like we can say when we sort of like be armchair therapists for our characters. And in Neil, I think there's a sort of more generalized, his parents had to achieve in order to get the visa, in order to get the green card. And so all you know is achievement. And something I thought a lot about, I appreciate you sort of like mentioning the multiple generations there too, is that this is not something that starts with second generation kids who grew up here. It starts with a migration process that requires, you know, our parents to have been in this mode of like dogged achievement since they were 16. And so to critique like the model minority myth or to critique tiger parenting, these things that are in the atmosphere, requires like understanding the sort of like generational burdens that people have shouldered.
It's one of the things that I love that you did in the story is that there's never any judgment passed on any of these characters. You really understand where they're coming from in terms of their motivations. They're based in real past experience, and that sort of generational trauma, that like passing some of that down, it's so very nuanced throughout the story, but it's there. I mean, you understand these characters and where they're coming from. So I really appreciated that part of the story. I wanted to kind of move towards this idea of sort of identity, dating, emasculation, cultural fetishization. It's something that I deal with in my story, in my debut. And it was really interesting to see how Neil deals with being sort of both emasculated by white culture, but also in one instance, he's actually fetishized for his culture, and which I feel like is so true. It's so honest to the Indian American experience. So for instance, he is at a bat mitzvah, and I just want to read this very short thing that I just loved. So his parents or his mother said, no close gdancing at this bat mitzvah that he's about to go to. So he says, I spent that night being taught how to grind by Gabby's spunky cousin from New Jersey, who informed me that she had kissed 2 Indian boys already and liked the chocolate look of us. In order to keep in contact with the thrilling Jersey Kaufman, I created an ill-fated screen name that followed me into high school. Neil _ Indian. It would be years before another girl displayed interest because of my race rather than despite it. I just wondered, like, can you talk a little bit about the extremes between like alienation, fetishization, of those from minority cultures, and as you kind of handle them in the book, and how both of these might impact brown kids who are sort of searching for love and searching for belonging.
Yeah. Yeah, something I noticed reading your book was I was like, these kids have so much more vocabulary, like your characters. And I think because they're like growing up today, like this vocabulary was not available.
Not at all.
I think when we were growing up. And so, and I feel this with students too, you know, teaching the next generation, teaching these like Gen Z kids whose politics are often impeccable and they've got all the vocabulary. But you know, when I was a teenager, like Neil doesn't sit there in that moment thinking like I'm being fetishized or exoticized. He's like, someone liked me. Like that's, and there is something that is like, I think it's super important to be able to have the sort of like political and social and moral language that often exists outside of literature. But sometimes you're writing from the perspective of someone who doesn't know everything that you know now. They can still be incredibly intelligent, as I think Neil is, but there's language that I didn't have in 2006. And so for Neil, a lot of it is just about a kind of loneliness that comes from knowing vaguely in the atmosphere that people don't want you.
Exactly.
And one thing that I think was interesting about writing this world is a lot of the characters are Indian American and Asian American. And that was true of my world. In high school, I went to a very white school, but all of my friends were Asian American, almost all of them. And yet, even within this community where theoretically we were taking ourselves for granted, everyone just carried around, I think, this sense of like not being wanted. And that, you know, that's not just being undesirable, it's feeling
Right.
at home. It's what you're pointing to about a sense of not belonging. And that's actually kind of why I was interested in like keeping this title. There was some conversation early on with people who read the book about the title, and I held really fast to it because I was really interested in the idea of like, what is a gold digger? A gold digger is someone who depends on another person for a sense of home and belonging, who other people might say like they're cheating to get their way, to get their sense of security, but they're doing it because they need it. And each of these characters in some way in the book is deeply dependent on another person to provide that sense of home. And it comes from this like, who wants you when you're the outsider. Yeah.
That's exactly right. I really got that. I was actually so amazed by how you were able to kind of do that so consistently, and it's felt so tightly woven in that sense. So it was amazing. I loved that aspect of the story. I was really curious about this concept of nonsense, the word nonsense. So this term in the story is used by Asian American parents in the book and nonsense meaning like don't get involved in that nonsense, as in corrupting influences of American society. So drinking, drugs, and dating is a part of that. And so I was really interested, like, okay, there was one page, I just wanted to read it. It's like just one line, but I loved it. On page 17. So it says, some kids my age drank alcohol, but I was afraid to, not because of the things the health class teacher cautioned would happen to your body and brain, but because of my mother's warnings that engaging in nonsense could abort all you were supposed to become, could in fact abort the very American dream we were duty bound to live out. Take the case of Ravi Reddy, whose parents had shipped him to Hyderabad to finish high school upon smelling beer on his breath. No one had heard from Ravi since, but my mother had hinted that she and my father were not above taking a leaf out of the Reddy's book. So, I mean, I just, that term nonsense, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like hitting so very close to home with just my own personal experiences. In my book, actually, I use the term hanky-panky, which is a little bit more about dating rather than like just in general drinking and drugs. So I loved the way you use that term. It's actually through Neil's dating that we get to witness like a sort of like, I don't want to say stunted development, but like he's kind of early on in the development stage when it comes to, being in relationships and, after finding himself sort of on the fringes, like you were talking about. How do you feel like the struggle with dating relationships plays out in the case of both Anita and Neil? Like how do they approach relationships, and how does that sort of impact their sense of identity? I think you kind of touched on some of that, but if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I think frankly, a lot of the Indian men I grew up around did not have their lives policed in the same way that the Indian women I grew up around did. There was a generalized fear of like, there are bad things out in the world that are coming for our kids, and those things are like the immoralities of American dating. But like, there is a way in which Indian women in the diaspora have many extra layers to deal with in terms of how people view their sexuality. And so Neil is like emasculated in the way that a lot of, I think, Asian American men have been since like the 19th century, when Chinese immigrants were forced to do traditionally female labor. Like that's been like legislated into the way we think about Asian masculinity. And so that's something that he deals with, which means that by the time he starts dating girls in California in his 20s, where like it's not that big a deal that he's brown, he's like playing catch up and is not particularly emotionally mature. But another thing is just that for him, just in the story level, this is just apart from all the sociology around the book, there's just only ever been one person for him, and that's Anita. And Anita, on the flip side, grew up really fast. And she grew up fast in part because she witnesses a really unhealthy dynamic between her mom and her father. And again, I think that's something that like a lot of Desi women I know, whether or not we had language for it at the time, there's something that you discern in your community about the way some women are treated, whether it's, you know, small disenfranchisement all the way to abuse. And so Anita sees an unequal and dangerous partnership, and that impacts her really deeply. And it also shapes the way she becomes sort of dependent and also scared of her own dependency on relationships in order to feel at home. I also just really appreciate talking about this as a love story, because it is that in so many ways. And I think sometimes amid all the like, let's talk about the writer of color, I don't get to talk about the love story that is actually really at the heart of it. So it's fun to talk about it in these terms too.
Yeah, there's actually one scene between the two of them. It's probably one of my favorite scenes in the book. And I might have you read it, because if you don't mind, unless you want me to read it. Let me just, oh boy. You know what, I will find it. I have it written down somewhere. It's basically anyway, it's a scene where Anita comes back after being, at cross country. Then she did some volunteer work. She's completely exhausted. She walks in, she sort of like dumps all the stuff on Neil. He's in her house. He was talking to her mom, and she reveals like so many of her struggles in that day that she had. And she ends up showing just so much vulnerability, which is unusual for Anita. And he says something like, "Can I make you chai?" And she smiles and she says yes. And so he's like, "Your mom taught me how to make it." So he makes it for her, and it's just this like beautiful moment of connection. And then speaking of sort of the model minority, it's sort of like that moment where she really is revealing how much she's actually dealing with on a daily basis, and that he is there and like prides himself on knowing what she needs. Like in that moment, it was such a beautiful like moment between them, and it spoke so many volumes about how they kind of are going through similar things, and how he's really a part of her family. I mean, that's the other thing I loved about the story, is that how much time he's spending at these two women's home. And so I'm sorry, I couldn't find the page, but speaking of, so I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about ambition and greed in this story. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference between ambition and greed and like their connection in general to the immigrant experience as the characters in the story live it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the two are intricately related, and I don't know how often the book actually disentangles the two. I think a lot of that happens in the reading experience. And I don't think when I was writing it, I don't think I was like, let me figure out where I will be ambiguous and where I will judge. It's just those two are so tightly wound together, period. And I mean, gold is a really good example of it, kind of bringing it back to those two aspects of gold that we talked about. In alchemy, the core idea in alchemy, ranging from China to India to Europe, everyone has this idea that if you can make gold from scratch and then potentially drink it, like that's the golden elixir, you live forever. And there is something so compelling about that. There is something compelling about the hunt and about the quest. There's also a lot of bad stuff that happens as a result. Like one of the things you see in all these history books is the little anecdote that the Chinese alchemists were the ones who created gunpowder, because that was a byproduct of this quest. And so having something intangible and impossible to lust for and to strive toward is so human. And it's also how we do our worst. And so alchemy is one example of that. The gold rush, I think, is another example of that. Like, I don't know about you, but I remember studying the gold rush in American history in middle and high school and being taught that it was like a tale of ambition and a tale of like, look at these people who went out west to make their fortune, with sort of no discussion about like stolen land and killing people whose original land it was. And I mean, in Georgia in particular, we know about everyone kind of knows about the 49ers gold rush, but I grew up in Georgia and there was a 29ers gold rush here in Dahlonega, and it preceded the Trail of Tears. And that's like a really direct linkage that I think people don't talk about, because so much of American mythology is about like Lone Rangers, manifest destiny, push west, and always, always, always want more. And so I do feel quite critical of the narrative that I was raised on, both the Indian narrative that I was raised on, that was like, we came here and you got to make good. But I think I feel more resentment for the American exceptionalist narrative. But then there's the inevitable fact that like I am who I am because I was ambitious. And so I don't know what it's like to be any other way. And I think a lot of people don't. And so can we find a way to notice the sort of moral questionability and deep immorality that is inherent in like the things that drive us every day? It's paralyzing if you think too hard about it.
Exactly. I was also just thinking too about the story. It feels a lot of South Asian stories tend to feel kind of a little bit more serious, kind of like maybe loneliness at its core. I feel like you know what I mean. This story is so funny and irreverent, and it deals with some themes, from other stories I've read, but it is a really different like tone and feeling. Was that really intentional at all on your part, or was that just based in the character? Did the character come first and that sort of drove that tone, or did you kind of, intend to write something? I know that there is sort of that magical realism component, so I wondered how much of that played into that sort of irreverent, funny, sparky kind of tone to the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of it was like a lot of my early 20s writing was bad knockoff, lonely, somber psychological realism. And it took me a while to learn that I didn't like that when I did it. There are some people who do it really well, but I do also have I think I discovered that I had a problem with that aesthetic as I was writing.
Yeah.
And I was like, why did I feel like I had to write that way? And the answer is kind of that, like, that's who publishing published. And that's more importantly, that's who publishing elevated for decades, is like, you had Jhumpa Lahiri and that was it. That was like the one writer that anyone was told about, brown, white, that's who you got. Yeah. And so there was this elevation of, I always think about that Chimamanda Adichie talk about like the dangers of a single story. What we had, I think, was the dangers of a single aesthetic, which is subtler, but still a version of having the same story. And one thing that I think about a lot that there's kind of no space for in the lonely first gen narrative is the idea that the first gen is flawed. And like Salman Rushdie talks about this concept of the India of the mind, what happens when you are estranged and by the process of migration. And what happens is that you construct a new India. And that happens through literary fiction. It also happens through what is often like a conservative imagination of the diaspora, whether it's saying that like as though hanky-panky and nonsense doesn't happen back there. And so one of the things that I think being sharper, snarkier, and more sarcastic made space for was like actually kind of a political worldview that I discovered I hold about the fact that maybe we shouldn't take for granted the nostalgia that reconstructs India as this like perfect conservative place. That in fact, maybe there's a way of seeing things more faithfully or creating things more faithfully, rendering the truth better by being snarkier.
Exactly. We've got a really great question here. This is from Kurt. Staging is one of the themes in the book. Staging of homes, staging of lives, staging through social media. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Wow, that's a really nice reading. Yeah, I want to hear Kurt talk about it. Honestly, that's a great thread. I mean, I guess now you mention it, yeah, performance is kind of what happens when you don't know what the inner life is supposed to be, right? Like I'm moving right now, and so I've been thinking about the open house stuff that's in the house, that's in the book, and this thing of it's not just putting on a good face, it's not just keeping up with the Joneses. Like for my mother, like renovation and redoing of a house is like a sport. It is a competitive sport. It's like
absolutely
you can create a life by creating a space. And so in that sense, I'm not entirely like critical of the instinct to stage, whether it's stage a house or stage yourself online. Like we have to do what we have to do in order to invent ourselves. And these characters don't feel like they have the right to invent themselves in the same way that their white peers do.
That's such a great point. I mean, as a minority writer, do you feel as though these like promotional events that you've been doing now, do you find that it's kind of tough to navigate some of the questions that come your way? Are there certain challenges that are thrown at you in terms of like, what are some of the toughest topics for you to sort of expound upon? Like one thing I noticed is it's set of skills to like create a story from the heart, and then yet quite another to have to like talk about themes in your book. And I'm like, oh, I could have used some tutorials on that aspect of it. So I just wondered, like, do you find that as well? And what are some of those tough topics that you find yourself like, I need to like do a little research before I have my next event and go on camera and talk about this particular thing?
Well, there's an essay that I should try to drop in the chat, or if anyone's by their keyboard more readily. The director of the Iowa Writers Workshop, Sam Chang, wrote an essay called "Writers Protect Your Inner Life." It was originally a speech, and it's about exactly this, about how when you are talking about books, you are in an external life, and it is not the same thing as what happens when you sit down to write. And the big example of it for me has been like, how do I talk about, oh, thank you, Daniel. How do I talk about these like sociological trends that surround the book? It also
Right.
happened a little bit because, I mean, the book is about Asian Americans in Atlanta, and the spa shooting happened like just days before the book came out. And it's almost like people have forgotten because there have been so many other mass shootings. But that meant that I was suddenly, I think, like in a stream of conversation that was like more explicitly political than I think I had intended to be. In
Right.
some ways, it feels like I get to talk about the things that are like murky and intimate in like clearer terms. Like when you're writing nonfiction in a moment like that, all of a sudden, like morality is super clear in a way that it's not when you're like writing a novel.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, like, I think you're right. Like there is maybe like a PSA that we should have at the start of any one of these books. That's like, we're discovering a lot of this as we talk. Like the book is its own invention. And I finished editing this like over a year ago. And so it exists, like what's happening now is like a parallel conversation. But it's not the actual book. Yeah, which is, it's interesting. It's like writing the book, leaving it alone for a while, and then coming back and hosting a seminar on it. And it feels like I'm teaching someone else's work sometimes. I don't know if that feels right.
Someone else's work, and you're also representing your culture. So then there's that whole layer of that, like, okay, you are talking about, because you're of a minority culture, you're representing that culture. And so then there's a little bit of stress there. I mean, at least for me, I'm feeling like I need to make sure that I'm getting some of this right in the way I'm sharing about it. And a lot of it is just on the fly, I mean, you've got a question coming your way and you're like, all right, I'm going to do my best at, expressing this the best way I can. But a lot of it is, as you said, you're learning as you go.
I mean, I think the big thing that I think about a lot is just like, it seems so basic, but it comes up more frequently than I would have thought, is just like the kind of constant reminder that in this way we have of talking about representational politics, like a story is still just a story.
Yeah.
And like there's a moment I really love in the novel The Buddha of Suburbia by Hanif Kureishi, which is an extremely irreverent story where someone gets mad at this brown actor for portraying his uncle as sort of a hysterical and ridiculous figure. And they're like, you're making us look bad. And they're like, you're making all Black people, all Asian people, every minority in England looks bad because of the way that you've portrayed this character. And he's like, I'm talking about one old man, one guy. Let me tell that one story. And so I think that's super important to keep in mind, is that we're in a moment where we often, like, the stakes of the outside world are so intense that we need everything to play into a political world. But fiction and politics they inform each other, but they are separate and they don't serve the same function. Like it's helpful to have good politics to write the book, but the book doesn't serve as a vessel for those. The book is separate.
Exactly. I love that. I'm gonna write that down, and I'm going with that. Thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this beautiful cover of yours. There was something so familiar and striking to me about aspects of this cover that I actually couldn't put my finger on. And then I watched a portion of one of your other talks, and it sort of helped me understand what it was about this cover that sort of struck such a personal and nostalgic almost chord for me. Can you talk a little bit about how the cover came about, and where it originated from, the idea of it?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that's like the book apart from the novel. I wrote this book and then I was like, is it going to look like an Indian book or is it going to look like an American book? Like, is there going to be an Indian woman in a sari on the front? Like, obviously my publishers are too amazing. They would not have done that to me at all. But that's still like, there's a handbook for how writers of color have been marketed. And I really appreciated just how insanely patient my editor was as we talked through what the book actually was. And we did a bunch of drafts, and I think there was a sense that like stuff wasn't quite there yet. And then at one point I just sent over a bunch of art from this awesome shop in Bombay that I love. All of this art behind me is from there too, called Culture Shop. And it's just a lot of like kitsch graphic design. And this takes old Indian matchbox art and basically fills it in. So like matchboxes just used to be these like riots of of color. And they have that like old advertisement feel. And so the designers, we took it to Indian designers, and like hip Indian designers who know what the tropes are and can then innovate upon it. And they filled it in with all these little motifs from the book. So you've got Indian matchbox stuff, but then you've got these cul-de-sac houses, like really cookie cutter. And then, you know, little jhumka earrings, a pickaxe and a shovel for the gold rush. Like they totally outdid themselves. And I think it came from like my publisher being really patient and listening to me, which I really appreciated.
That is the best, having those kinds of publishers. And I felt the same with mine. I was so grateful that it takes time and it takes just so many conversations and reaching out to different people. So I'm so excited about how the cover turned out. I was going to say, like, could you talk to us a little bit about, we have a few more minutes here. Just if anybody has any more questions, you can put it in.
We have one that came through the Q&A, not the chat, but I can't, where is that?
Oh, you're right. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. No, I just saw that.
So it says,
okay.
yes. So it says, I read this book in a boozeless book club, and many members of the group remarked how the character's need for gold felt so familiar to our own struggles with alcohol or addiction. Was that purposeful, and did the author pull from their own experiences with addiction?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I've gotten a few times from people that it has felt a little like an addiction novel. And I wasn't drawing from anything really personal about substances, but I think the ways in which I've seen addiction and dependence happen in adulthood has not been like the way that it's there in the culture around, like people like have visions about like, this is what an alcoholic looks like.
Right.
But dependence is like I've seen people become very dependent on things that are not substances. And so while it is literally a substance, it is a magical elixir in the book. For me, it started from a very conceptual place of realizing that as a teenager, I had become very addicted to ambition, and I did not know how to go without it because it was what fueled me. But then it manifests in a bunch of these other ways. And I talked to friends who had like a little bit more intimate experience with addiction in the sections where Neil starts having a really unhealthy relationship with cocaine and Adderall. He drinks a lot in his 20s. And I think that's sort of a like filling the void of what he lost when he grows up and out of that like hyperachievement culture. But I mean, one of the things about having the book in the world is that I've heard from people who relate to it in ways that I had no idea people could. So I really appreciate that.
I love that. Yeah, it's always sort of so informative when you see how other people are, they read into things that you never even kind of considered. That always feels kind of magical. There was another question, and now I'm not seeing it. I don't know, it sort of seemed to have disappeared on my
Ephemera
here. Will the recording of this conversation be available afterwards? I'd love to share it with my book club. Yeah, so Daniel's taking care. He will take care of that. So could you tell us just a little bit about the TV adaptation that you're working on with Mindy Kaling?
Yeah, it's really early stages, so it's super exciting. Last summer, I heard that we were in talks with her production company, and you know, I have admired her since I saw like the Diwali episode of The Office.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
All the way through the mini project and Never Have I Ever, and she's really talk about doing our stories in a way that is like irreverent.
Absolutely.
So yeah, like aesthetically, it was a really cool fit. It was really, really surreal. Right now, we are just interviewing showrunners. So I'm co-writing the adaptation, but we're basically interviewing people to do it with me who have more experience in screenwriting. And hopefully we'll go out and start pitching it to networks pretty soon. And there are a million things that have to happen for something to go from being a book to actually on your screen. But, you know, fingers crossed, it would be really cool to actually get to make it into a show.
Oh my gosh, I can so picture this. I mean, so easily. And to hear that Mindy was a part of it, I was like, yes, that is such a perfect marriage. Um, so yeah, are there any other things that you wanted to talk about tonight, or if there are any other questions or any?
This was such a pleasure for me. I think we got through everyone's questions. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, Daniel, are you feeling there? Are you there? There you
I was
are.
there, then I wasn't there, then I was there again. I wanted to mention that yes, we will have a recording. We take a little while to edit and take out some of the Daniel stuff. And also, I just want to mention that we do have signed book plates, which I think available. And I did want to also mention, I am also a fan of the Buddha of Suburbia. My hardcover.
And you have a beautiful first edition. No, that's the edition I have. No one has that.
You and me, just you and me. Is there a store if somebody wanted personalization? What is your local bookstore that you send people to if they want to get like a personalization? I know, yes, well, I know where we get American Betiya, that's with us.
Well, yeah, you should order from Boswell, but we also have copies here at Acapella Books in Atlanta.
Oh, cool. That's great.
Yeah.
Because sometimes somebody wants it to be to somebody. So, and we also love wherever you buy, of course, we love for you to buy the book from us, but if you buy it from whatever independent bookstore, you might want to mention how great this event was and they should go watch it, but whatever. Thank you both. What a wonderful, speaking of great events, what a wonderful evening it's been. I wanted to thank everybody for coming and hope to see you at another event. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
So much. Thanks, Anurada. Thanks, Daniel. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.